outside, officially, I think it's outside the city limits of Cincinnati.
Only be roused from your sleep. Dare to see the truth. Dare to utilize the truth. And the God of truth will make you free. Huzzah! Christopher Gadsden. I've got to start though with two people who have absolutely roused Clarendon County, roused South Carolina from their sleep, and that's regarding the Revolution, and especially Francis Marion. Let's give a big huzzah to George and to Carol. I'm going to pass around Gadsden's painting from when he was in his 70s, so you know who we're talking about. And I'm going to walk you through some arguments, not quite a bibliography, but some things so that 30-some minutes from now you'll think differently about Christopher Gadsden. 11 years before Patrick Henry, he was using the phrase on top of his weekly column in the South Carolina Gazette, Aut Mors aut Libertas. Jackie, you know what that means in English out of Latin? Aut Mors, M-O-R-S, aut Libertas. Gave you the big hint. Death or liberty. So our liberty or death, give me liberty or give me death, is not Patrick Henry's in our first state in our colony in South Carolina. It's Christopher Gadsden's. Another is that he abided by throughout his life. He will live to be 81 years old. I would sacrifice an entire estate on the altar of liberty and the cause of my country. And his most frequent, he wrote a lot, so we know what he said, and an awful lot of friends and enemies wrote about him. And one of his frequent phrases, his in-your-face comments at house parties and dinner guests, meetings under the Liberty Tree, in and out of the provincial Congress, and up at the Continental Congress was, "What are you doing for your country?" So John Kennedy took that one from him. It was always, "What are you doing for our country?" So I show you the first image of Christopher Gadsden. Prominent statesman, soldier, Continental Brigadier General, radical patriot as opposed to the more conservative ones who will become his enemies. Clearly the key word is passionate, and then I would add the word bully. He was in your face and when you didn't want him to be in there. And I couldn't quite understand until I actually started studying him closer. You know, why or maybe how does a person take that excess from passionate to bully? Which we today, of course, use as a negative expression. He probably, it was a good thing that he was such in the sense of later Teddy Roosevelt would try to emulate him for his ideas. You are looking at the first painting of Christopher Gadsden. And his provincial father, who was a pensioner, a royal pensioner, he was a low-level port authority for Charlestown, and his mother called him Kitty. So throughout most of his youthful, well into his teens, his parents called him Kitty. He wore the long hair like that, and I guess if you were treated like that, either by perhaps a dad who drank too much or a mother who was overbearing, you would rise up into passion into something. That is Christopher Gadsden's first portrait, because we got to look at the facts as we go through. Those of you who know me, I like to take down acronyms because it's how I can think about things later and remember them. So we're going to use, on your paper, write down G-A-D-S-D-E-N, Gadsden, right? And we'll fill it in, or your questions as we go forth through today. But the most important part of the whole Gadsden word is the Stamp Act. He bled, believed, realized, lived, and then made sure with thousands of words and publications that everybody remembered he was the instrument most radical in the Stamp Act, 1765. Now, do we all know what the Stamp Act was?
Yes.
Okay, of course, it's the idea that the British want to tax us, and the way they do it, Parliament does it by putting stamps onto all of our official papers, but it would also include all land deeds, almanacs, dice, playing cards. When I came here from Maryland 20 years ago to be a lawyer, we still put stamps on your deeds. And I go, oh my gosh, I don't know what country I'm in again. Just like they did, and just like they were offended by with Christopher Gadsden. So these Massachusetts, those troublemakers up there always call for things first, and they said, well, we'll do it in one of the mid-Atlantic states, New England, mid-Atlantic, and South. And the middle state, of course, was New York. We don't see it that way today, do we? And they called for a Congress to meet in New York in 1765 to deal with and oppose this issue of having the Parliament finance their empire and tax us related without having a representative of us in the Parliament doing it. And so if you get nothing else out of the next 30 minutes, you have to understand what a tremendously radical concept that was, at least for a few of them. So in terms of the revenue, think external taxation versus internal taxation. They weren't fighting against the taxation. They were just the concept that we should have a say in who it's taxed and how it's taxed. So the New Englanders in the middle states, colonies, call for this Congress. But it won't really be a Congress unless it includes at least some of the colonies in the South. And remember, we got South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia. We also have the other two that everybody forgets, East Florida and West Florida. Well, nobody comes from there except the South Carolinians. And they send 3 people to the Stamp Act Congress. And those 3 are Christopher Gadsden, Thomas Lynch Sr., and a person who's 12 or 13 years younger than Christopher Gadsden, John Rutledge. And what makes Thomas Lynch interesting, the senior, is not only can you go to his house today and his son's house, but they're the father-son team that signed the Declaration of Independence. Oh, that's right, I forgot. They're the only space left in all the signatures because the father got sick, went down to Annapolis, died in Annapolis before he could sign it. So the one blank you see on the signatures is for the Thomas Lynch who served with Chris Gadsden at the Stamp Act. And then this up-and-coming, really intelligent person who would be known as John Rutledge. And at the Stamp Act, there were only 27 delegates. And if it had not been for Chris Gadsden and his 2 colleagues, it would not be a Congress because there were only 3 from those 5 southern states to make it, a continental kind of version. And in 1765, they went up there. And Thomas Lynch was much more conservative and richer than Christopher Gadsden. He's an indigo and rice planter on the Santee at Hopsawee. His house is a great visit. And John Rutledge was up and coming, and he was what you would call in terms of, let me use the word, a conservative patriot, if you would, as opposed to Christopher Gadsden, who was developing this idea either from his parents related to being much more radical. So here's what the Stamp Act does. They get into this long debate that has nothing to do with the stamps, as all Congresses would do. And they go into this issue of taxation, and they go into the issue of philosophy, but all 27 seem to be pretty committed that we have to talk to one another. Because after all, South Carolina is much more important than any concept, any New England state or middle state. And so the majority of the delegates to the Stamp Act Congress decide to start out with 2 petitions, one to the House of Lords and one to the King himself. And it says in several paragraphs and phrases which have come down to us in bits and pieces, one through Caesar Rodney, who was in Pennsylvania at that time, and one from a Marylander who kept a record, and it was transcribed a couple of months later in the Maryland Assembly, House of Assembly. So they talk about, we really are loyal subjects, we're good and faithful Englishmen, we just want to exert our English rights, and Christopher Gadsden accepted all that. But then he went on to help author a petition called the Declaration of Rights. And the Declaration of Rights is really interesting. Remember, this is 11 years before the fighting war. And it said that in addition to proclaiming loyalty to the Crown, the Declaration of Rights, which we should all read as a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, said that only representatives chosen by the colonies had the right or ability to levy a tax. In other words, you have two problems, England. Either let the colonial government tax ourselves, or you got to give us seats in the House of Parliament, and they were not going to do that, not to mention the geographic and problem that would be related to that. So he also added the right, first time written in America, the right to, as a Congress, the right to a trial by jury. So see how far we are removed from the stamp issue already? And of course, Christopher Gadsden, in your face, what are we going to do together? How are we going to end this with Britain? Is in the minority of that. So he said we should not send those petitions, because if you throw a softball, they'll think that that's all we got. We got to throw a hard ball, being the Declaration of Rights. Of course, he's in the minority and he loses. But he will forever rise up in there, and for a few moments when he was in one of his frothy, passionate debates in the Stamp Act Congress, he used the word independence. Now, in all sincerity, he absolutely believed and was fighting for English rights. We weren't trying to be independent. That concept wouldn't even be settled until well into the 1780s in terms of our own colony and our state here in South Carolina. He was an Englishman demanding the rights of Englishmen all across the world, no matter where they are, especially in the colonies and in the colony of South Carolina. But in that debate, he uses the word independence once or twice, and a couple people heard it and said, treason, treasonous. And so he will, as the country, which he was way out in front of, Chris Gadsden, as that came together and we became a country, and as somewhere during the fighting war, when people finally settled on the issue of independence, and that wasn't at the Declaration of Independence, he then continues to write his personal PR, public relations, about how much he was first to talk about it. Now, we're going to go through some other images, but I want to show you how his mind began to be created. Not that I'm a psychologist, but from some factual issues. For a year, I had a good professor who's talked here before, Daniel Tortora, teach me about the French and Indian Wars, which are 59, 60, and 61, especially in South Carolina. And I came to understand how much we don't know, even those of us who study history. And in that time, right before, Gadsden was creating an artillery unit in 1757, and he would fight with the royal governors of South Carolina, one being Grant, a commander, one being Littleton later. And his argument was that only the House that we had of the Commons in South Carolina could vote the money for the artillery. It couldn't come externally. Or another way to phrase it, there was another rule that he fought against. The governor could use his prerogative, think of it as a veto, and he could overrule anything that the people voted on. So he was fighting those two issues. Who funds, kind of similar to what what we just saw in the 1765 Stamp Act, and that came from this issue of he was the captain of an artillery unit in Charlestown, which he funded, paid for, and said, the money's got to come from the right source. And of course, the more the governors understood that he was, radical, or he was less than the most loyal the way the governors saw it, he would, they weren't going to, give him the money for reimbursement for his artillery unit. So it stands a lot from something that happens before and during the French and Indian War. The other interesting thing is, Gadsden is a long-standing member of the Anglican Church. He's a real, a real serious Christian, and he's quoting scripture right and left, like we just did, starting off his quote this morning. You cannot read a paragraph without him quoting scripture or paraphrasing scripture. But he will spend his entire church, his life, his spiritual life, in the Anglican Church, which will then become the Episcopal Church, or the Episcopal Protestant Church of South Carolina after the war. And he'll do it in one parish, St. Philip's Church. So he's baptized there, confirmed there, receives Eucharist there, and will be married there 3 times. He will die there and be buried there. all at St. Philip's Church. So if you need to go visit the site of where he spent so much of his spiritual life. Yet, even as, and what's one of the issues we had as a colonist in South Carolina? The Anglican and the Episcopal Church, which later became the Episcopal Church, was the official established church. So all of us, well, I say all of us, Catholics aren't even allowed here, so we'll throw them out. But other than a few friendships with Jews because they were rich merchants, we were going to have an official church. So even if you were a dissenter or you belonged as a Baptist like Richard Furman, you're still going to pay for the Anglican Church. Well, this very committed, very ritualistic, except for the Pope, concept of a churchgoer all of his life, never varies from it, is one of the first speakers against an established church. He speaks up early in the colonial House of Commons for disestablishment of the Anglican Church. And again, see how that goes back to the money concept? We'll get to the don't tread on me in a minute, and then I want to go down to the defiant revolutionary. It's important to know who your enemies are too. I mean, I'm running for political office now, so I know what that concept. And his enemies are going to be John Rutledge, who we think, and I think of as heroes, Henry Lawrence, his best friend, born 8 days later, and their main two townhomes in Charleston were across the street from each other in Ansonboro. Lawrence's house is still there, Gadsden's is not. And so best friends will become his mortal enemy. So we have John Rutledge, Henry Lawrence. Then we're going to have bigwigs like General Robert Howe, who he's going to fight a duel in. And then we've got other South Carolinians like Alexander Gillen, who will be major roles in our naval forces and then continue to bother him in politics. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So if I had to put on the revolutionary scale, you have to divide into two parties. Maybe not Democrats and Republicans, but also clearly in terms of conservative and radical. And then we get down to engagements. We'll talk about those. But here's the thing I didn't know. Christopher Gadsden was one of our chief engineers. He wasn't trained as an engineer. He's trained as a money man, a purser, and a mercantile guy. But in fact, he builds two structures, which at the time they built were the largest in any of the colonies, and I mean including the 4 Canadian colonies. And they are a wharf. He builds a wharf in 1766, a pier if you would, and that pier is 805 feet long by 360 feet long. He goes into great detail about what he pays for it. It cost back then $20,000, and it's completed in about a year. He thought of himself as the Costco of Charlestown. So, and guy was brilliant in terms of this. He would take this wharf. I would get you to stop thinking of it as a pier. Think of it as an airport. It could hold 6, at the same time, 6 of the largest vessels England ever sent over other than warships, merchant ships. And then it could hold various other schooners, etc. And his goal with building this wharf was to control, or at least be a big player, which he turned out to be, in terms of his interest in taking the inland goods and selling them overseas, as opposed to his good friend Henry Lawrence, who's the other way around. His big issue is importing. So you would think in your minds, if Lawrence is a factor for English people, Christopher Gadsden is the factor for Americans. And that'll play a role here too. Then he does something else. In 77, we all know about the Battle of the fort on Sullivan's Island, which Moultrie controlled. And they had this pontoonish kind of, maybe-ish kind of half boats, half ladders, and they stretched it across the little bit of a gulf or the river there, and so that there would be an escape route in 1776 out of the fort. And South Carolina realized real quickly in 1777 and 78 that they had to build a permanent one. And of course, what but a merchant like Walmart or Costco, Christopher Gadsden, gets the commission to do that. And so it takes him about 2 years to build this zigzag bridge. Cost him a lot of personal money. He also got reimbursed a lot of money, and he'll be accused of that later. That was the longest bridge in the then continental United States, up in 1778 and up to the Revolution. So he clearly, I'm not saying he did all the work, he's got a lot of slaves, he hires people. Rum was his big issue on building both the wharf and the bridge. He had to have a lot of rum to supply the contract workers, and the bridge ultimately becomes zigzag. And they think the reason for that is, well, first of all, they didn't have engineers to go under the water as such, but they did a great job of doing it. And it lasted. There was a huge storm, not quite hurricane level, that struck Charlestown during the Revolution, and his wharf was the only one on the east side of the city that did not collapse. So you wouldn't think of him doing that, but he's doing that at the same time he's fighting for political and military rights. And then you understand where he comes from, and this is the one that kind of makes me excited. He is the co-founder in October 13th, 1775 of the Continental Navy, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Here's St. Philip's Church. He does, when you go down there, you'll look for his grave, and you'll be shown his parents' grave, Thomas and his wife, but you won't find him because his will was carried out by the personal representative or the executor, and it said that I'm to be buried in an unmarked grave. So he's right next to or somewhere around the stone which marks his parents. But you got to go back deep into a person's makeup to understand where they came from. In 1740s, 45, he goes over to England as part of not a training, because his dad wasn't that rich to put him in a school over there like other South Carolinians, but he's on his way back from a visit with family because some of his father's relatives obviously still live there. And in the middle of the voyage back on the ship, he gets pushed into the job of being the purser when the purser on the HMS ship dies en route. And so in his teenage years, he becomes, or at 19, he becomes the purser of this ship. So he actually gets pushed into His Majesty's service in the Navy, which gives him an array of visitation that a 19-year-old would never be able to see. He goes to 5 or 6 countries over the next 2.5 years, obviously because he can't get out of serving as the purser on that ship. He even fights in a battle, called famous battle that the British launched against the French. I think it said Louisburg is what it's called, or help me out there, Ben. What is that actually?
Yeah.
Fort what?
Louisburg.
Louisburg. And so he sees things that most South Carolinians have never seen. And of course, this is another image. Are we passing the old image around? So everybody's seeing Chris Gadsden. This is probably how he would like to be remembered. 1724 was a good year, the same year Henry Lawrence was born. The more I study the Revolution, the more ignorant I realize I am of its reasons, its cause. And we have to go back. I thought we'd only go back to French and Indian, but we got to go back even further. This is the South Carolina makeup at the time that all the way up until the Stamp Act, and maybe a little longer, 1760s. So we're talking 1740s to 50s to 60s in South Carolina. And I've never quite seen it broken this way, but the regulars, of course, are the Englishmen who come over. Then we have the independents. This is what they were called while Christopher Gadsden is serving 19 terms in the House of Commons, later to be the General Assembly of South Carolina. Then we have provisionals that will be created by statute of the Commons House. So now you've seen, in terms of stamp taxation, you've seen in royal ability to raise money, and now in military control, how much lower the Englishmen in South Carolina were pushed down by Parliament and the King. And all of these are affecting Christopher Gadsden. It's a wonder he didn't explode or burst from a nervous breakdown earlier. And others aren't bothered by it. So in other words, in order, this is order of authority. The Commons House only comes in third. So our own people can't station people or order the stationing. Then they have Rangers, which is a division of provincials. And then we have, and this is a general, but it holds for about 20 years. Then we've got militia, just ignore the 1665. And of course, their idea was they're sworn in for like 3 months or 6 months, and we send them out to nowhere like 96 or Greenwood, and they got to serve time somewhere protecting us from the Indians and Native Americans. And then, of course, nobody turns down a guy who just says, hey, I'd like to come along for this battle or that service, and they pay for their own uniform and all. We call those volunteers. I think you would think the difference today would be the National Guard would be, which I just learned from George today, is actually controlled by the 9th Air Force, like McIntyre is under the authority of the commander I was with yesterday. They would be the militia, and the volunteers would be either us, if we join in, or what we call the South Carolina Guard. So what I really want to convey there is we have the tax issue, we have the financing issue, we have a trade issue, and we have the military issue, all of which really ticked off Christopher Gadsden more than it seemed to tick off others. Best friends, grew up childhood friends. I've got to find the quote related here. They took a blood oath as teenagers. They cut themselves, did the blood together, and swore that they would live a Christian, virtuous life. Remember, Chris's dad had been a drunk, a royal authority down lower and kind of a drunk. And Henry Lawrence had lifted himself up from where he was. And so they took an oath, made a common cause to support and encourage each other in every virtuous pursuit, to shun every path of vice and folly, to leave company whenever intended to licentiousness. And both of those men actually did lead their lives that way. Another good friend of his is Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and again, all these men deserve a whole talk. He will be one of the candidates for President of the United States, and as we all know, George Washington, it wasn't unanimous. Remember, each elector got 2 votes. One goes for George Washington, and that was unanimous, and then everybody else voted for who they wanted. And one of those electors in the first presidential election was Christopher Gadsden. We had 7 electors. One was Henry Lawrence, and they each pushed their first vote for George Washington, but then Christopher Gadsden voted for his good friend, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. It's really exciting. Up in Camden, we have the records, and you can open the lawsuits of this guy, and he's both a defendant and a plaintiff asking for money back over the 10 years after the Revolution was real good for lawyers. Okay, then we have the flag issue. And this becomes important because I used to share with people, this is the first flag of South Carolina. I'm wrong on that. That was a misspeak on my part. However, it is Christopher Gadsden's flag, and he took the 1754 concept of Benjamin Franklin, which was the snake all cut up, join or die, which had come from the 1750s issues. And you see how the 1750s had their issue, Chris Gadsden's, with the royal governors, if I'm making that connection with you. And then in the 1760s, we're going to have it again. Well, in 1775, this former impressed into service for His Majesty's service purser for 2.5 years is now on one of the millions of committees that Congress creates. Of course, see, some things don't change. And he's on a committee called, first it was called the Marine Committee, and then in October, John Adams stepped aside and the Continental Congress elected Christopher Gadsden to be on this committee. They changed the committee's name to the Naval Committee. It would later change back to the Marine Committee. And in October of 1775, he is debating the funding of what a Navy would be and how much it cost. And the guy who knew the most about what things cost would be the South Carolinian former purser who had to pay for everything, both supplies and men, etc., on a ship. And then he also had been a merchant for 20 years, right? The Costco of South Carolina, so he understood what it would cost to build and do one. And he's the impetus, Chris Gadsden, of the largest ship ever built by the United States in the Revolutionary War. And what's its name? The South Carolina. Of course, it wasn't built here. It never came to South Carolina, but it served great service. Largest ship, you got to look that up if you've never seen it. The paintings, we have 2 paintings of it, they're wonderful. So he comes up with the idea, well, we need a flag. And so he says, seeing all the rattlesnakes in South Carolina in the Low Country. He puts the snake back together and curls it up. And you all know that part. And he actually talks about this because he spends a lot of time writing it. He says it's noble because it gives you a warning with its rattle. It doesn't attack unless it's attacked, which means defense. But once it attacks, it's deadly. So those 3 points he writes over again and again. So he takes the flag and he puts it on the 2 primary colors, just like National Geographic and Time Magazine always use red and yellow on their cover. And he says to his Connecticut friend that he had met back in the Stamp Act Congress, who's now in the Continental Congress, Essex Hopkins, we're going to make this great ship captain a Commodore. And Essex Hopkins becomes the Commodore of the United States Navy, 9 months before we declared our own country. And Essex Hopkins said, well, I need a flag. And Christopher Gadsden, either he was looking at a drummer outside, or he was remembering Benjamin Franklin, or any number of things he had seen in Philadelphia. And he puts the flag together, pays for it, and hands it to the Commodore of the United States of the Continental Navy, and he flies it from the top mast. And then Essex Hopkins says, well, I want another one. And he, together with Christopher Gadsden, create the red and white striped one with the Don't Tread on Me flag stretched out. And to this day, the red and white flag is flown on from the bow of every flagship of every fleet in the United States Navy since 9/11. So that's actually the Essex Hopkins / Chris Gadsden. Now what we need to do is put this on the top of every ship, right? So we can reclaim South Carolina's role. So that's where the Don't Tread on Me comes from. John Rutledge will be 12 or 13 years younger. He's a real conservative, and he will always try to position himself, whereas Gadsden, being a lot wealthier than John Rutledge and 12 or 15 years ahead of him in terms of work and business, he says, well, what can you do for your country? Whereas John Rutledge, as good as he was as president of South Carolina and governor, often always said, well, what's in it for me as well? And then we have Thomas Lynch Sr., who we've talked about. Let me mention the wives real quick. He's married 3 times, has 2 children by his first wife. He, like Henry Lawrence, will lose a son. Henry Lawrence in combat, but Christopher Gadsden twice. He'll lose his namesake, Chris Jr. That should read 1766. So after his son dies, he immediately puts all his effort into building the largest airport in the continental United States, which was his wharf. And he later marries Mary Hassel. She will live together for 14 years, have 4 children, and oh gosh, I didn't put the name of the one, but Thomas's grandchild is Thomas's son, which is Christopher Gadsden's grandson, is the famous Gadsden Purchase. And what part of the United States is that? Arizona, very good. I just wanted to make sure we were on the page. And then Anne Ragg, he'll marry right afterwards. And she's 45 years old, and here's what's important to her. Her daddy was one of the most famous Tories who stayed in Charlestown. So his brother-in-laws, his father-in-law are all Tories at this point. A couple other quotes we talked about. I only want to stand as an Englishman. Then he takes a battle fought in 1266, and he names his plantation in Georgetown after it. And Charles, I've done a lot more homework on this. The building actually dates from 1750. So there's an extant structure on 1,000 acres, 250 available for sale today, and the house, called Benevento. And I had no idea what that ancient battle was about, but there was a king of Sicily, so it was an attack by revolutionaries to beat a king's troops. So there is something he was thinking about as early as 1750. It was his daddy's plantation, but he built the house. It's 10 miles north of Georgetown. Would that be right about that? Off Route 431. It's private property, but on one of our SCAR visits, we could certainly take you there. Here are some other great quotes. Everything had to do with Scripture, Jackie, and with God, and he always put that right back in. And then, last but not least, I want to finish up with this. After the war, we have a big issue related to what do we do to screw the people we just beat? Right? And of course, politicians call it something different. And we called it the Confiscation and Amercement Acts. And there's 7 different levels of that, including not counting the levels of different taxation. Well, interestingly enough, Christopher Gadsden, the in-your-face, independent, radical kill 'em all kind of guy, turns in 1782 at the Jackson Borough Assembly, right before he's elected governor, and turns it down. He says, "Vengeance belongeth to the Almighty. However, a just retaliation upon an abandoned and cruel enemy may be sometime absolutely necessary and unavoidable." Back in the war, he actually put a bounty on Cornwallis's literal head. If somebody would cut off his head and bring it to him, so he's reaching into scripture for that. Of course, he was at the battle, the famous battle where we beat back the British in 1776, for Charlestown, but this is on the other side. He's at Fort Johnson. So he only fires 2 or 3 cannon, and then they're unable to hit the British fleet. That is, however, a powder magazine, which I believe may date from that battle. This is a little bit smaller than the one that was built in Camden. Almost finished, George. Here's the modern version of it. It's open to the public. It's where College of Charleston has, and down in here, right there, is the powder magazine. But there's a whole bunch of other neat features like cisterns that date from his time there that you got to go see. So don't let the gate intimidate you just going in and say you're a taxpayer and you want to see it. Here's the Navy ships. And this was the largest ship the Continental Navy ever put in. Again, South Carolina ahead of the curve. And then there's the picture I showed you. Here's St. Philip's Cemetery. That's his, I'm sorry my picture's so poor, that's his grave, his parents' grave. He's on one side or the other. And then we go back to what I'd like to leave you with, and then I'll be glad to answer questions. I'm amazed the more you actually study one of these individuals or do it to the level that Ms. Pritchard did last night, and isn't it amazing what you learn? And what I want you to do is think about these guys, but we have to really start thinking not only about what they did for the 8.5 years of the war and the politics, but where did those concepts come from? And I owe a lot to Daniel Tortora and to people like Ben Rubin, who are professors who teach us how to do that, because these people just didn't create these ideas. I wish we had time, which I don't, to tell you all the bad words that are used by Alexander Gillen and John Rutledge. But let me give you the Robert Howe duel, because duels are famous, but they usually only end up in the paper if you kill somebody. So General Robert Howe was the commander of the South Carolina Department before Lee, okay? And he comes down and he's having this fight, and then of course the Battle of Fort Moultrie takes place, and Howe is still left here when Lee goes elsewhere. And in 77 and 78, over a year and a half, Robert Howe, Continental General, is having a political war with Continental General and South Carolinian Christopher Gadsden. So finally, as all things end, they say, well, let's man up about this, and they go out into a field, except they pick the field on his home front yard, Christopher Gadsden's, under the Liberty Tree. Gosh, I never even talked about the Sons of Liberty, who Christopher Gadsden started, and he was turned against him. So they go out under the Liberty Tree, and several people wrote about this, whether it's, whether obviously they weren't recording it. Howe says, "Fire first, sir," and Gadsden says, "You, sir, fire first." They're aiming the pistols. "Then we will both fire together." Gadsden did not answer, so Howe finally raised his pistol and points it close enough, but not too close, and it takes off a piece of Christopher Gadsden's ear. And Christopher Gadsden slowly, because now there's only one ball per pistol, and he raises his and he says, "Okay, General Howe, and he did write this, you brought me out to play this ball game, and you ought to begin. You've begun the entertainment, and so I'll finish it." And he fires wide, and neither of them get killed, and they remain mortal enemies. But they're not the only 2 Continental Generals who fought over it. So we owe an awful lot, my summation would be, to Christopher Gadsden. One thing I'd ask you to do, we need to take back from the Tea Party, because it's not radical enough, our flag, which Christopher Gadsden flew, and then to all of those, with all respect to the Air Force, who flew in the United States Navy, was created because Christopher Gadsden, and thank you, sir, and my daughter right now is flying in a helicopter today over Korea, where she's serving her 2nd term, so a deployment. So we owe an awful lot to Christopher Gadsden that we can't let those other, they call themselves states, take from South Carolina. Let's hear it for Christopher Gadsden. Hip hip! Hip hip! Hip hip! take any questions for a minute or two.
So Dave, how do you compare Gadsden with Sam Adams in Massachusetts?
They became drinking buddies at the Stamp Act in New York City in 1765, and they absolutely gave praise to each other in their letters. And historic, two points on that. Believe it or not, the founders are all asked who founded us. So you read John Adams, you read Monroe, you read people. It's not in Washington, but other places. And guess who they named? Samuel Adams and Christopher Gadsden. Good question. Any others?
What was the fort that you showed, when he was first and all that? You didn't,
It was Fort
Louisburg. French outpost on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. And it's been restored, most of it's been restored or rebuilt by the Canadian government. I was there in the early 70s when it was still being rebuilt, and I hear it's a fantastic place. I want to go back, but I haven't been.
Now I got a test and a quick gift. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Did he and Henry Lawrence ever patch up their differences?
They did not, but their wives made them civil.
David, excellent presentation. Thank you for giving it. A couple of quick notes. He mentioned that Gadsden was voted as governor, but turned it down. I think that's worth of a little bit more statement. It's indicative of the man. And, he had a lot to give to his country and to his state. He was very proud. Plus, he was in St. Augustine for 42 months.
Oh, I forgot. At my age, 55, he was in, they gave them parole, all the other people they brought from Charlestown, and the guy drew a line in the sand like at the Alamo, and he said, the British commander, I'll give you free reign of all the taverns and all the houses you can walk around St. Augustine if you'll re-accept parole. And Gadsden's the only one in St. Augustine who said, hey, you violated my parole in Charleston when you captured me in 1780 in May, then why should I even believe somebody who's a liar? And they put him for 42 weeks, and the cell was still there, you could see it. He was never allowed out in the courtyard. So he ate there, wrote there with a candle, sometimes he would get a candle.
One of the few in solitary confinement, and they just absolutely hated him.
Now, real quick, can somebody name 3 similarities or more between Henry Lawrence, his best friend and enemy, and Christopher Gadsden? Yes, ma'am.
Henry Lawrence was in the Tower in London.
Good, so both were in prison. Keep going.
Rich. You're both rich.
Yeah, they are both rich, Lawrence being richer. Somebody give me more than one.
Both lost sons.
What?
Both lost sons.
Both lost sons. I'm going to go. Yours is good, though. People forgot that. So I'm giving you.
I taught South Carolina history in the 8th grade.
Well, then you'll be proud of that.